The sun had already begun to slide down from the afternoon sky when Jamal left his school with his backpack hanging low and his sketchbook tucked carefully under his arm. For most children, the walk through the park was simply part of the routine. For Jamal, however, it was the only time of day when he could feel free, surrounded by the trees, the benches, and the laughter of strangers. Jamal was different. He was only 14 years old and he was deaf. He had lived his entire life in a world without sound, a world where silence was his constant companion. Yet in that silence he had created a place of beauty and color through his sketches. Every page of his book carried a small piece of his heart. He drew superheroes not because he wanted to escape reality, but because he wanted to show the world how he viewed courage. He drew his family because they were his anchor, especially his father, who was more than just a parent. He was the Attorney General of the state, a man who had risen against all odds to protect people like him. Jamal adored his father but also lived in his shadow. He wanted to be seen for who he was, not just as the Attorney General's son. As he walked through the park that day, Jamal stopped near a bench and began to sketch a woman holding her child's hand. He was lost in the details of their smiles when he felt a strange vibration in the ground. Looking up, he noticed people staring in one direction. His eyes followed theirs and he saw a police officer approaching. Jamal's first thought was confusion. He had done nothing wrong. His second thought was worry. He knew from his father's warnings that sometimes the world did not see young boys like him as children. The officer was calling out, but Jamal could not hear the words. He saw the man's lips moving quickly, his hand pointing at Jamal, his steps heavy and sharp. Jamal tilted his head trying to read the expression, but it was not kindness. It was suspicion. The officer grew closer, and Jamal instinctively raised his hand slightly, the way his father had taught him if he was ever confronted and could not understand. His sketchbook slipped under his arm, nearly falling to the ground. People in the park began to gather. Some looked concerned, some curious, and a few raised their phones to record what was happening. Jamal did not know what to do. He could not hear the commands, but he tried to show he was no threat. He pointed to his ears, shaking his head, then held up his sketchbook, hoping the officer would realize. But the officer's face hardened, misunderstanding every gesture. To Jamal, it felt like the world was moving in slow motion. He could see the officer's mouth opening wide, his arm moving stiffly. He tried to sign, to explain, but he knew not everyone understood sign language. He glanced around, searching for anyone who might help. The crowd whispered, some realizing too late that the boy in front of the officer was deaf. A woman near the benches put her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. He was not afraid of the officer's uniform, but of the misunderstanding that was growing heavier by the second. He had always trusted his father's words, that truth had power, that innocence could shine through. But at that moment he felt small, powerless, and alone. The officer grew more impatient. He stepped closer, his voice now louder, though Jamal only saw the angry shape of his lips. He waved his hand, pointing to the ground as if demanding something Jamal could not comprehend. Jamal froze, unsure of how to obey instructions he could not hear. His hands shook as he lifted them higher, his sketchbook finally falling open, the pages fluttering like fragile wings. The crowd gasped as one of the pages landed near the officer's feet, a drawing of Jamal and his father standing together, holding hands, smiling under a sky of blue. It was a drawing of trust, of love, of a bond between a child and his parent. But the officer did not look down. His eyes stayed locked on Jamal, reading fear where there was only confusion. Jamal dropped to his knees, raising his hands higher, tears beginning to fill his eyes. He wanted to shout, but his world gave him no voice. He wanted to explain, but his hands could not form words that others would understand. The silence that had always been his safe space now became his greatest enemy. Behind the officer, more people had gathered, whispering urgently. A man's voice rose above the rest. "He's deaf. He cannot hear you." The officer barely turned his head. Doubt flickered across his face, but authority kept him from stepping back. Jamal stared up, pleading with his eyes, hoping that silence itself would speak for him. For Jamal, time stood still. He thought of his father. He thought of his father's lessons about dignity, about never letting fear define him. He thought of his dream of becoming an artist whose drawings would hang in galleries, not flutter helplessly on a park pavement. He thought of the stories he had read about boys like him who were misunderstood, whose innocence had been overlooked. And then, most of all, he thought of the one thing his father had always promised. No matter where you are, I will always be there for you. The crowd grew restless. Some shouted again that Jamal was deaf, their voices laced with urgency. Others covered their mouths, unable to look. Jamal remained on his knees, his eyes fixed on the officer, his heart aching for understanding. His hands trembled in the air, open and empty. The world seemed to hold its breath, and in that frozen silence, just as despair threatened to crush him, the sound of sirens echoed through the streets. The crowd turned as a black SUV screeched to a halt near the park. The doors opened and a man in a dark suit stepped out with urgency in his stride. His eyes scanned the scene, locking instantly on the boy kneeling on the ground. The world around him faded as he saw his son, vulnerable and afraid. The man was Jamal's father, the Attorney General. And in that single moment, everything was about to change. The sirens faded into the background as Jamal's father pushed through the gathering crowd. The people stepped aside quickly, some whispering his name, others realizing only now that the boy kneeling on the ground was not just anyone's child. The Attorney General's shoes clicked against the pavement as he moved faster, his heart pounding with a weight heavier than any courtroom battle he had ever fought. His eyes locked onto his son, who remained frozen with his hands raised, his sketchbook scattered across the ground. Jamal's lips were trembling, and though he could not hear the commotion, he could feel the vibration of chaos around him. He looked like a child lost in a storm. The officer did not lower his stance. His eyes darted between the Attorney General and the boy, uncertainty flickering but pride stiffening his posture. Jamal's father lifted his hand, his voice calm yet firm, commanding attention from everyone present. He spoke not only as a father, but as a man who had carried the weight of justice for years. "That boy is my son," he said. "He is deaf. He cannot hear you." The crowd erupted, some clapping, others yelling in relief that someone had finally arrived to defend the boy. But the officer hesitated, still gripped by the fear that had consumed him moments earlier. For Jamal, everything blurred. He saw his father's face, the strong jaw he had always trusted, the eyes that now brimmed with both fury and heartbreak. Tears slid down Jamal's cheeks, and though he could not hear his father's voice, he recognized the authority in his gestures, the protective stance he had seen countless times before when his father defended the weak in court. Jamal wanted to run into his father's arms, but his body felt too heavy, his fear anchoring him to the ground. The officer shifted his weight, confusion battling with defensiveness. He muttered something under his breath, but the words did not matter. What mattered was the look in Jamal's father's eyes, the look of a man who had spent his career believing in the law, only to see it twisted against his own child. The crowd leaned in, phones raised, recording every second. Each frame would soon flood across the internet, replayed millions of times, carrying with it the image of a boy with raised hands and a father standing between him and injustice. Jamal's father crouched down, his expensive suit brushing the dirt as he reached for his son. His hand rested on Jamal's shoulder, grounding him, telling him without words that he was safe now. Jamal clutched his father's wrist, squeezing tightly as if to say, I tried to show him." The boy's sketchbook lay open nearby, the drawing of father and son fluttering gently in the wind, unnoticed by the officer who had nearly destroyed everything. The crowd grew louder. Voices demanded accountability. Some shouted at the officer. Others begged for calm, fearing the tension might spark something worse. Jamal's father rose slowly, his presence towering, his words cutting through the noise like a blade. "You drew your weapon on a child who could not hear you. You mistook silence for defiance. You mistook innocence for threat." The officer opened his mouth, but the Attorney General did not let him speak. "You will answer for this, not just to me, not just to this boy, but to every parent who fears for their child's life when they walk outside." Reporters had begun arriving, their cameras flashing, their microphones stretching toward him. He ignored them, focusing only on Jamal, who now leaned against him, exhausted from fear. The boy closed his eyes, breathing shallow but steady, his body trembling in his father's arms. The Attorney General whispered something in sign language, his movements sharp but full of tenderness. "You are safe. I am here." Jamal opened his eyes and nodded faintly, a single tear sliding down his face. The officer shifted again, lowering his weapon reluctantly, his authority slipping under the weight of the truth. The Attorney General turned his gaze on him, eyes cold, voice steady. "Holster it now." The command carried no hesitation, no room for argument. The officer obeyed, his hand trembling as he slid the gun back into place. The crowd erupted in applause, relief mixing with righteous anger. Some hugged each other, others raised their fists, chanting for justice. But for Jamal's father, the moment was not about the crowd, nor the cameras, nor even the humiliation of the officer. It was about the boy he held in his arms, the boy who had almost been lost because the world refused to see him clearly. He had always told Jamal that silence could be a strength, that it could teach him to observe what others missed. Yet here, silence had nearly cost him his life. The Attorney General's chest tightened as he realized the fight ahead was not just about his son. It was about every child who had been overlooked, unheard or misjudged. The ambulance arrived, its doors swinging open as paramedics rushed out. Jamal's father lifted his son gently, carrying him toward safety. The crowd parted once more, some reaching out to touch his shoulder in solidarity, others bowing their heads in respect. Inside the ambulance, Jamal clung to his sketchbook, refusing to let it go. His father sat beside him, holding his hand, promising with every heartbeat that he would not allow this wound to be forgotten. As the ambulance doors closed, the officer stood frozen in place, surrounded by the crowd's judgment. His career, his choices, his actions, all of it now under the shadow of the Attorney General's glare. The cameras captured his unease, but they also captured something larger. A father's love, unshakable and fierce, rising above fear. And so the world had witnessed a scene it would never forget. A deaf boy misunderstood, a father arriving seconds too late to stop the fear, and a crowd that became the eyes and ears of justice. For Jamal's father, the battle had only begun. He knew this was not just an isolated event, but a symbol of everything broken in the system he had sworn to uphold. He would fight now, not from the safety of his office, but from the place where it mattered most, beside his son, for his son, and for every child like him. The sirens wailed again as the ambulance pulled away. The crowd dispersed slowly, still buzzing with the shock of what they had witnessed. But the story had already left the park. It was racing through phones, across screens, spreading into homes, offices, and schools. A boy's silence had spoken louder than words, and a father's presence had turned that silence into a demand for change. In that moment, nothing was the same. The boy was no longer just Jamal, he was a symbol. And the Attorney General was no longer just a state official. He was a father on a mission, and his mission would shake the nation. The ride in the ambulance was a blur for Jamal. He lay against the stretcher, clutching his sketchbook as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the world. The paramedics worked around him, checking his pulse and his breathing, but his eyes remained fixed on the ceiling. He could not hear the sirens, only feel the vibration through the metal frame beneath him. Every tremor was a reminder of the chaos he had just endured. His hands trembled as he ran his fingers across the pages of his sketchbook, smudging pencil lines that had once been perfect. He tried to remember his father's touch, the steady hand on his shoulder, the look of strength in his eyes. That was the only thing calming him, the only thing telling him he was still safe. His father sat beside him in the ambulance, his face a mask of control, though inside he was raging with fear. The Attorney General was a man who had faced lawmakers, judges, and even the most powerful corporations, but nothing compared to watching his son crumble in silence, misunderstood and nearly broken. He held Jamal's hand tightly, signing with his free hand when he could. "I am here. Do not be afraid. You are strong." Jamal nodded faintly, his tears mixing with a small smile that appeared when he saw his father's steady gestures. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. Doctors rushed Jamal into a room. Nurses filled the space with urgent movement, and the air smelled of antiseptic and worry. His father followed closely, refusing to leave his side. He explained to every nurse and doctor who entered that his son was deaf, that they needed to use gestures, that they needed to show him patience. Some nodded with understanding. Others simply worked as quickly as possible. Jamal's father stood at the head of the bed, watching every step, making sure his boy knew he was not alone. Outside the room, the waiting area filled with reporters and onlookers. News of the incident had spread quickly. Social media was flooded with shaky videos of Jamal on his knees in the park, his hands raised high, his sketchbook fluttering on the ground. The words "he is deaf" echoed across captions and headlines. The story had already become more than an isolated event. It was now a reflection of a greater struggle, a mirror of the fears held by countless families. But inside the room for Jamal and his father, it was simply a battle for calm, for healing, for reassurance that life would continue beyond this moment. When Jamal finally drifted to sleep, his father stepped into the hallway. Cameras flashed instantly, microphones stretched forward, and voices called out his name. He raised his hand and the crowd quieted. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. My son was confronted in a public park. He was threatened because he could not hear commands he never understood. He is 14 years old. He was holding a sketchbook, not a weapon. This should never have happened. His words struck the reporters, some lowering their microphones as if they were ashamed to even hold them up. He continued, "I am speaking to you not as the Attorney General, but as a father. My son is alive tonight because of restraint, because of timing, but this is not about luck. This is about accountability. This is about change." The world listened. Within hours, the videos had been replayed on every major network. Commentators debated, activists spoke out, and families shared their own stories of misunderstanding and fear. The officer who had pointed his weapon at Jamal was placed on administrative leave, his face plastered across screens alongside clips of the Attorney General's statement. Some defended him, saying he acted out of caution. Others condemned him, pointing out the failure to recognize the signs of a deaf child trying desperately to communicate. Meanwhile, Jamal's father stayed in the hospital room, refusing to leave. He pulled up a chair beside his son's bed, the hum of machines filling the silence. He opened Jamal's sketchbook, flipping through the pages, studying every drawing with new weight. The superheroes looked different now. Their capes were symbols of hope, but their faces carried a sadness he had never noticed before. The family portraits were warm yet fragile, and the drawing of the father and son under the sky, it nearly broke him. It was no longer just a drawing. It was a reminder of how close he had come to losing the most important person in his life. Jamal stirred in his sleep, reaching for the sketchbook. His father quickly placed it in his hands, and Jamal held it against his chest, sighing softly. The Attorney General leaned closer, whispering in a voice his son could not hear, yet a voice filled with devotion. "I promise you, my boy, this will not be forgotten. You will not be forgotten." He brushed his hand across Jamal's forehead gently, the way he had when Jamal was a child afraid of the dark. The next morning, the hospital was surrounded by supporters. People brought signs, candles, and flowers. Some wrote messages on pieces of cardboard. "Hands are not weapons." Others simply gathered in silence, showing solidarity. Inside, Jamal was awake again, his eyes clearer, his smile faint but present. His father signed to him, explaining how many people had come, how many voices were rising for him. Jamal's eyes widened, surprise written across his face. He had always felt small, invisible, hidden behind the silence of his world. Now, for the first time, he realized his silence had spoken louder than words. His father explained that change would come, that this was the beginning of something larger than either of them. Jamal nodded slowly, his hands forming a single sign: hope. His father mirrored the gesture, his chest swelling with pride and sorrow all at once. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be debates, trials, opposition, but sitting there with his son alive beside him, he also knew there was no greater mission than this. By evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Jamal's father stood at the hospital window looking out at the gathering crowd. He could hear their chants, their calls for justice, and though he had given many speeches in his life, he realized this fight would be different. This was not about politics or policy. This was about protecting every child who deserved to be seen as innocent. Every parent who deserved to watch their child grow without fear. He turned back to Jamal, who had fallen asleep again, his sketchbook resting on his chest. The Attorney General whispered one last promise before stepping out into the hallway to face the world. "You are my strength, my reason, my son. I will fight for you, and I will fight for every child who carries hope in their hands." The cameras waited, the people waited, and the world was about to hear a father's voice, not as a politician, not as a leader, but as a man who refused to let silence be mistaken for threat ever again. The hospital became more than a place of healing. By the second day, it turned into a fortress of hope, grief, and rising voices. Outside its glass doors, candles burned through the night, their light flickering against posters held high. Some carried Jamal's name, others showed sketches printed from the videos online, but all of them carried one message: enough was enough. Inside, the Attorney General watched from his son's bedside, his jaw clenched, his heart torn between the role of a father and the duty of a leader. He had always believed the two could exist side by side, but this moment forced him to see the truth. He was not standing in a courtroom. He was standing in the middle of a storm that threatened to tear apart not just his family, but the very system he had sworn to uphold. Jamal rested quietly, his sketchbook lying beside him like a shield. He looked smaller than his 14 years, the weight of fear still visible in his eyes when he woke and reached instinctively for his father's hand. Each time his father was there, steady and unshaken, signing to him softly, "You are not alone, you are safe, I will not leave." Those simple gestures reminded Jamal that even in silence, love was louder than fear. But the Attorney General knew silence could not win battles outside this room. He would have to raise his voice, and not just for his son. That afternoon, he stepped into a press conference that had been hastily arranged in the hospital's lobby. Reporters crowded the space, cameras lined the walls, and the low hum of murmurs filled the air until he walked in. The room fell quiet as he approached the podium. For a moment, he looked down at his hands, remembering how they had held his son just hours earlier, trembling with fear. Then he looked up, his voice calm yet edged with fire. "My son is alive, but my son is not the same. He is 14, he is deaf." He was holding a sketchbook, not a weapon. He raised his hands to show he was no threat, but his hands were mistaken for danger. "My family is grateful he is still here, but gratitude is not enough. We cannot thank luck for sparing lives when systems built on misunderstanding and fear continue to put them at risk." His words rang out, steady and clear, each syllable carrying the weight of both heartbreak and authority. The crowd outside the hospital cheered as the speech played on live screens. Inside, journalists scribbled notes furiously, some wiping their eyes, others shifting uncomfortably as they realized the depth of what was unfolding. The Attorney General pressed forward. "This is not just about Jamal. This is about every child who has been told to fear, every parent who has felt powerless when their child stepped outside. My son cannot hear commands, but he can see the world. He can see the fear in a man's eyes when he looks at him. He can see the lack of patience when he raises his hands. He can see the misunderstanding that could have cost him his life. And if he can see it at 14, then so can all of us." His words traveled far beyond the hospital walls. They spread into homes, classrooms, offices, and living rooms. They landed on ears that had never truly listened before, forcing conversations that many had long avoided. Some called him brave. Others accused him of bias, saying he was too close to the case. But he did not care. He was not speaking as the state's Attorney General. He was speaking as a father who had almost lost the boy he loved most in the world. Back upstairs, Jamal watched clips of the speech on a small tablet. His father's words translated into captions at the bottom of the screen. His eyes widened as he saw the crowd chanting outside, people holding signs, strangers crying for him. He looked at his father and signed slowly, his hands forming careful shapes. "They see me now." His father nodded, signing back with conviction. They will never look away again. The following days were a whirlwind. Investigators moved quickly, the officer's name released to the public, his actions dissected by analysts and activists alike. Some defended his split-second judgment, insisting he was protecting himself. But the images of Jamal on his knees, his sketchbook on the ground, his hands raised high in surrender, told a different story. And the Attorney General knew those images would not fade. They would become the turning point he had long fought for in quieter ways. Meetings filled his schedule. Calls from governors, senators, and even the president flooded in. Everyone wanted his opinion, his voice, his guidance on how to move forward. He had never felt such pressure, but he also had never felt such clarity. His mission was not political. It was personal. He drafted proposals from his hospital desk, demanding reforms in training, accountability, and disability awareness. He spoke with law enforcement leaders, some supportive, others resistant. Yet every time doubt crept into his mind, he only had to look at Jamal's face, the boy whose silence had changed everything. Late one evening, after another round of meetings, he returned to Jamal's room to find his son sketching again. The boy's hands moved confidently, pencil gliding across the page, each stroke deliberate. When he was done, he turned the sketch toward his father. It was a picture of the hospital, the crowd outside holding signs, and in the middle a small figure standing strong with his hands raised. Not in fear, but in victory. His father's throat tightened, his eyes stung, but he managed to smile. Jamal signed a single word beneath the drawing: justice. The Attorney General placed his hand over Jamal's, nodding slowly. Yes, he whispered, his voice breaking though Jamal could not hear it. Justice. The next morning he called a meeting with his senior staff. This case will not be buried. We will pursue every step of accountability, and we will push reforms that should have been implemented long ago. If the system is broken, then we will rebuild it. If the training is flawed, then we will change it. And if the culture resists, then we will fight until it no longer can. His staff looked at him with a mixture of awe and determination. They had never seen him like this, fueled not only by duty but by love, by the unshakable resolve of a father protecting his child. News outlets called it a movement. Social media turned Jamal's sketches into symbols. His superheroes shared with captions about strength, hope, and innocence. Children across the country drew their own hands raised in peace, posting them online with the message, "Hands are not weapons." It was no longer just about Jamal. It was about every child who had been misunderstood, every parent who had feared a phone call that might change their life forever. Through it all, Jamal's father remained steady. His fury had not vanished, but it had been sharpened into resolve. He knew the battle would be long, but he also knew that his son's story had already planted seeds that could not be uprooted. One day he thought Jamal would look back at this time and see not only the pain but the power it created. And perhaps then, the world would truly understand what it meant to see beyond silence, to see humanity where once they had seen threat. That night, as the city quieted outside the hospital windows, Jamal's father sat by his bed again, watching his son breathe peacefully. He signed softly, though Jamal was asleep. "You gave me strength. You gave them courage. You gave the world a reason to listen." He leaned back, eyes heavy but heart awake, knowing tomorrow would bring another fight, another challenge. But tonight, he allowed himself to simply be a father, holding his son's hand, refusing to let go. And so the storm outside grew louder, the movement spread wider, and the fight for justice deepened. But within that hospital room, there was only a father and his boy, bound together by love, by silence, and by a promise that their story would change everything. The hospital days blended together like pages in Jamal's sketchbook, one moment spilling into the next. The boy was slowly regaining his strength, though every time he opened his eyes he seemed older than his years, as if silence had carried not just stillness, but wisdom far beyond his age. His father never left his side, but outside those sterile walls a storm was building. What had happened in the park was no longer a local incident. It had spread like wildfire across the nation, and with every replayed video clip, every headline, every caption written by strangers who felt Jamal's pain, the pressure on the system mounted. The Attorney General had always believed in the law as a shield, a way to protect the powerless, but now he realized the shield had cracks. He spent his mornings with Jamal, holding his hand, watching him draw, reassuring him through sign language that the world was still safe, that he would not let fear take away his childhood. In the afternoons, he faced the cameras, the microphones, the endless questions from journalists who demanded answers not just as professionals, but as people who could no longer deny the truth staring back at them. And in the evenings, he sat in long meetings with lawmakers, activists, and community leaders trying to craft something bigger than speeches, reforms that would last, rules that would make sure no other child would feel what Jamal had felt. Inside Jamal's room, the boy drew endlessly, his pencil carved stories without words, his art becoming the language of the movement outside. He sketched not only what he remembered, the officer's stiff posture, the way the crowd had watched in fear, the moment his sketchbook had fallen to the ground, but also what he hoped for. He drew hands reaching out in peace, children smiling under open skies, police officers shaking hands with boys and girls instead of confronting them. When his father returned from meetings, exhausted but unbroken, Jamal showed him each drawing. The Attorney General would place his hand over the paper, close his eyes, and whisper a silent promise. "We will make this real." But the fight was not simple. The officer involved hired lawyers who argued loudly on television that he had followed his training, that he had acted reasonably in a moment of fear. Talk shows brought in commentators who debated the case as if it were an abstract scenario, rather than a boy's life. Some asked why Jamal had not complied, why he had not made it clearer that he was deaf. Each word stung, but Jamal's father reminded himself that these voices were the very reason change was needed. For too long, excuses had been made in place of accountability. For too long, the system had failed to see people as people. The investigation moved quickly because of the pressure, but the Attorney General stayed careful not to blur the line between his duty and his personal pain. He recused himself from directly prosecuting the case, but he appointed the strongest, most principled prosecutors he knew, reminding them every day that the eyes of the nation were upon them. The evidence was clear. Jamal was unarmed. He had raised his hands. Witnesses had shouted that he was deaf. The videos left little room for doubt. Yet his father knew better than anyone that truth and justice were not always the same in practice. Truth could be twisted. Justice could be delayed. But this time, he promised himself, truth would not be buried. As the weeks passed, Jamal grew stronger. His wounds healed, but his silence remained heavy. He spoke less even in sign, preferring instead to pour everything into his drawings. His father worried, but also recognized the power in it. The drawings began to appear outside the hospital. Supporters printed them onto posters, shared them online, and even painted them as murals across city walls. A simple sketch of two hands touching, a child's hand and an officer's hand, spread across the internet with the caption, "See me, don't fear me." Jamal did not know how far his art had traveled, but his father showed him on the tablet. Jamal's eyes widened in disbelief, his lips curling into the smallest smile as he realized that in his own way, he was speaking to the world. Meanwhile, the Attorney General faced battles behind closed doors. Some politicians whispered that he should step aside completely, that his personal involvement was clouding the case. Others accused him of fueling unrest, but he stood firm. He reminded them that his son was not a symbol, not a headline, but a child. He reminded them that leadership meant standing where it hurt most, not hiding behind neutrality. His resolve was unshakable, his words sharp but measured. He did not ask for sympathy. He demanded accountability. The trial was scheduled, and the tension in the city grew thick. People camped outside the courthouse, their chants rising like thunder each evening. Parents brought their children, teaching them not only about the pain of injustice but about the power of standing together. The Attorney General prepared himself not just for legal arguments, but for the emotional storm that awaited. He knew the defense would paint his son as suspicious, that they would twist his silence into defiance, his gestures into threat. But he also knew the truth was stronger, and when the truth had faces, drawings, and voices chanting outside, it could no longer be ignored. One night, as he returned to the hospital after a long strategy session, he found Jamal sitting up in bed, his sketchbook open to a new page. This time the drawing was of a courtroom. The judge's bench towered at the front, the jury sat lined in chairs, and in the middle was Jamal himself, standing not as a victim but as a witness. His hands were raised not in surrender but in communication, fingers shaping the language he had always known. His father stared at the picture for a long time, then looked at his son. Jamal signed carefully, his eyes steady. "I want them to see me. Not just you, me." The Attorney General's heart swelled with pride and fear at once. He nodded slowly, signing back. "They will see you, and they will hear you even in silence." That night he sat by Jamal's bed until the boy drifted off to sleep, his small hand resting on his father's arm. The weight of responsibility pressed heavier than ever, but there was also light in it. Jamal was not only his son. He was the heart of a movement, a reminder that justice was not abstract but human, not distant but close as a child's trembling hands and a father's unbroken promise. The fight for justice had already begun in the park, but now it was moving into the courtroom, into the legislature, into the hearts of families across the country. And though the Attorney General had spent his life believing in justice as an idea, he now understood it as something deeper. Justice was not ink on a page or arguments in a chamber. Justice was his son's sketchbook, filled with drawings of hope. Justice was a boy who had survived misunderstanding and fear. Justice was love turned into action, and this time, justice would not be delayed. The courthouse was a place the Attorney General had entered countless times before, but never like this. On this morning, he was not only a man of law but a father walking into a building where the very system he had dedicated his life to would be tested against the truth of what had happened to his son. Outside the courthouse, thousands of people gathered. Some carried signs with Jamal's sketches printed across them. Others stood silently with candles, and still others raised their hands high as a symbol of the boy's innocence. The chants rose and fell like waves, a mix of grief, hope, and determination. For many, Jamal had become more than a child. He had become the face of every family who feared misunderstanding could take away someone they loved. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, the kind of silence that carried its own echo. The courtroom benches filled quickly. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras clicked despite the judge's request for restraint, and families sat close together, their eyes wide with expectation. The Attorney General sat with Jamal at his side, though his son was not dressed in a suit or polished shoes. Jamal wore simple clothes, his sketchbook tucked under his arm like it always was. He looked small in the grand room, but when his eyes lifted, they carried a strength that even the marble pillars could not overshadow. The officer who had confronted Jamal sat at the defense table, his posture stiff, his face pale but defiant. His lawyers whispered constantly, shuffling papers and adjusting their ties. They had prepared their arguments well, that the officer had been acting within his training, that he had seconds to decide, that fear had guided him. But Jamal's father knew fear was not a shield for mistakes that nearly cost lives. Fear did not excuse the refusal to see a child for who he truly was. The prosecutors presented the first pieces of evidence. The videos recorded by bystanders played on a large screen for the jury. The footage showed Jamal kneeling, his sketchbook falling open, his hands raised high. The whispers of the crowd on the video echoed faintly through the speakers. "He's deaf, he's deaf." The jurors leaned forward, some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads. The truth was clear in the grainy pixels. A boy who could not hear was trying to show his innocence, yet he was met with suspicion instead of patience. Witnesses took the stand, one after another. A woman who had shouted that Jamal was deaf recounted the fear in her voice when the officer ignored her. A man who had filmed the incident explained how helpless he felt, holding his phone as a child's life balanced on a thread. Even strangers who had been walking dogs or sitting on benches came forward, each of them carrying pieces of the puzzle that painted the same heartbreaking picture. Jamal had done nothing wrong. He had simply been a boy in a park. Then came the hardest moment. Jamal himself was called to testify. His father placed a steady hand on his shoulder as they guided him to the witness stand. The courtroom grew so quiet that even the air seemed to pause. An interpreter stood beside him, ready to translate his signs into words the jury could understand. Jamal's hands shook at first, but then he lifted them with the same courage he had drawn so many times on paper. He signed slowly, deliberately, his eyes focused on the jurors. I did not know what he was saying. I raised my hands. I tried to show I was not dangerous. I dropped my book. I wanted to go home. I wanted my dad. The interpreter's voice carried Jamal's words, but the jurors did not just hear the translation. They watched the boy's trembling fingers, the emotion in his movements, the honesty in his eyes. When he finished, the courtroom remained silent for several seconds, as if everyone was afraid to break the spell of truth he had just cast. The officer's lawyers shifted uncomfortably, their arguments suddenly fragile against the weight of a child's simple story. When Jamal returned to his seat, his father squeezed his hand tightly. The boy opened his sketchbook and drew a quick image of himself on the stand, his hands raised not in fear but in language. He slid the paper to his father, who closed his eyes briefly before tucking it safely into his jacket. He knew that image would remain with him forever. The defense argued next, their words sharp but hollow. They spoke of training manuals, split-second decisions, and the dangers officers faced daily. They painted the officer as a man caught in a moment of fear, doing what he thought necessary. But no argument could erase the drawings, the videos, the testimony of a boy who had tried to be seen but was almost erased. The Attorney General listened silently, his face calm, his anger buried beneath a surface of professionalism, but his heart burned with every twisted explanation. Days passed in the courtroom, each one filled with heavy testimonies and emotional weight. The jury listened, their expressions growing darker with each repetition of what had happened. Finally, the case came to a close. The judge gave instructions, the lawyers gave their final arguments, and the jury was sent to deliberate. Hours passed, though to Jamal's father it felt like years. He sat with his son in the hallway, signing softly to keep him calm, reassuring him that no matter what the jury decided, the truth had already been spoken. When the jury returned, the air inside the courtroom was electric. Everyone rose, then sat again, the wood of the benches creaking under the weight of anticipation. The foreperson stood, holding a folded piece of paper, and the judge asked for the verdict. The room seemed to hold its breath. The words came slowly, but they struck like thunder. Guilty. The officer lowered his head, his lawyers frozen in shock. The courtroom erupted, gasps and cries filling the air, but Jamal's father pulled his son close, holding him tightly. Jamal's eyes widened, and though he could not hear the noise, he saw the relief on faces around him. He signed quickly, his hands moving with a mix of joy and disbelief. They believed me. His father nodded, tears brimming in his eyes as he signed back. They saw you. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into chants, their voices rising into the evening sky. Candles were lit, songs were sung, and Jamal's drawings were held higher than ever. It was more than a legal victory. It was a declaration that silence had power, that innocence could not be ignored, that justice could still be found even in a flawed system. That night, as they returned home for the first time in weeks, Jamal sat at the kitchen table, his sketchbook open once again. He drew the courthouse, the jury, the crowd outside, and himself standing tall. For the first time, his figure was larger than the others in the drawing, not small or fragile, but central, strong. When he showed it to his father, the man smiled through his exhaustion, kissed his son's forehead, and whispered, "You are my hero." The fight was not over. There would be appeals. There would be debates. There would be those who resisted change. But as father and son sat together that night, they knew something had shifted. The courtroom reckoning had not only given them justice, it had given them a beginning, a chance to rebuild a world where silence was not a weakness but a voice strong enough to change everything. The days after the verdict did not feel like an ending, but like the slow turning of a massive wheel that had been rusted in place for far too long. The courthouse steps were still covered in flowers and candles, the walls nearby painted with murals of Jamal's sketches. Strangers who had never met him carried his drawings in their pockets. Children traced his superheroes on classroom walls, and families whispered his name when they spoke of hope. Jamal had not set out to be a symbol, but his silence had become a language the world could no longer ignore. At home, life began to take on a fragile rhythm again. The Attorney General returned to his office, though the weight of the trial still pressed heavily on his shoulders. His phone never stopped ringing, his email filled with messages from leaders, activists, and ordinary parents who simply wanted to say thank you. He listened to every story he could, sometimes nodding quietly, sometimes weeping silently when no one else was watching. His role as Attorney General had never been so personal, and for the first time in his career, every decision felt like it carried the heartbeat of his son, Jamal. Meanwhile, found his strength in drawing again. He filled page after page with images of what he wanted the world to become. He drew police officers kneeling beside children to help them, not confronting them. He drew schools where children with disabilities learned alongside others, their differences celebrated, not feared. He drew courtrooms filled with fairness, not prejudice, where the truth was not hidden but embraced. Each drawing was a window into his quiet vision, and his father often stood behind him watching, realizing that these sketches were more than art. They were blueprints for a world his son believed could exist. The reforms began quickly. The Attorney General introduced legislation requiring officers to undergo training in disability awareness and crisis communication. Body cameras became mandatory, reviewed by independent boards instead of hidden behind closed doors. Community programs sprouted across the state, pairing officers with local children, building bonds where once there had been only fear. Resistance came, of course. Loud voices calling the changes unnecessary, expensive, unrealistic. But the momentum of Jamal's story was unstoppable. Every time someone raised an objection, someone else raised a drawing, a photo, or a memory of that day in the park when silence was mistaken for defiance. National networks aired documentaries about Jamal, interviewing his teachers, his classmates, and even strangers who had been in the park. They spoke of his gentleness, his smile, his sketches that seemed to see more than most people ever could. Jamal himself appeared in one interview, signing his words slowly while the interpreter spoke. His message was simple but powerful. Do not be afraid of silence. Listen with your eyes. See me for who I am. The clip was shared millions of times, and classrooms across the country played it for their students. Teachers wrote to the Attorney General, saying children were learning sign language to show solidarity with Jamal and others like him. But beyond the noise of reform and recognition, there was the quiet reality of healing. Jamal still woke at night from dreams of the park, clutching his sketchbook to his chest. His father would sit beside him, holding his hand until he fell back asleep. There were moments when Jamal's eyes seemed far away, as if he were reliving the fear all over again. His father knew the wounds of the heart did not heal as quickly as the body, yet he also saw the resilience in his boy, the way he picked up his pencil every morning, the way he greeted each new day with courage. Months later, the Attorney General was invited to a national summit on justice reform. He stood before leaders from across the country, holding one of Jamal's sketches in his hand. It was the drawing of the courtroom, where Jamal had depicted himself standing strong as a witness. The Attorney General raised it for all to see. "This," he said, his voice steady, "is why we must change. Not for politics, not for power, but for children who deserve to grow up without fear. My son is not just my son. He is every child who has ever been misunderstood, and his silence has taught us more than 1,000 speeches ever could." The audience rose in applause, some in tears, others standing in awe of the man who spoke not from authority but from love. Back home, Jamal stood beside his father at a press conference on the steps of the state capitol. The crowd stretched as far as the eye could see, their chants rising into the sky. Jamal raised his hands not in surrender but in triumph, his fingers forming the sign for hope. The crowd mirrored him, thousands of hands raised in unison, fingers signing the same word. His father stood tall beside him, the weight of grief now transformed into the strength of purpose. Together they had turned fear into movement, silence into voice, and pain into progress. That evening, as the city quieted, Jamal and his father sat in their living room, the world outside still buzzing with change. Jamal flipped through his sketchbook, pausing at the drawing of himself and his father standing under a blue sky. He tapped the page, then looked at his father, signing slowly. "We made it true." His father smiled, pulling him into an embrace. "Yes," he whispered, even though Jamal could not hear it. "We made it true." Years later, people would still speak of the boy in the park, the sketchbook that became a voice, the Attorney General who chose to be a father first and a leader second. Jamal's drawings would hang in museums, studied not for their technique but for their truth. And children would continue to learn the lesson his silence had given the world, that hands raised in fear could become hands raised in hope, that justice was not an idea but a promise, and that even the quietest voices could shake the foundations of the strongest walls. For Jamal and his father, life would never return to what it had been before, but it did not need to. They had built something new, something stronger, something that would outlive both of them. And in the stillness of each evening, when the world outside seemed loud and restless, they could sit together in silence, knowing that their silence was no longer invisible. It was a legacy of change.